I think we are live now. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Doherty, and I am a research analyst with the NATO Association of Canada. We are a charitable NGO devoted to educating Canadians about the importance of NATO and the international rules-based order. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Jawad Hussain Qureshi and Dr. Joseph McQuade. Jawad is a senior South Asian analyst at the Privy Council office. He has focused on South Asia in his academic work at McGill, Concordia, and UBC. He has worked in Kandahar and Dakar while on assignments for the Canadian government. Jawad has also done secondments with defense and foreign affairs partners in Washington, Canberra, and published joint assessments with additional foreign partners. Prior to joining the Canadian federal government, Jawad worked in broadcast media in Pakistan and as a South Asian analyst with the International Crisis Group. Our other partner for today is Joseph McQuade, who is the editor-in-chief of the NATO Association of Canada, where he runs the Center for Disinformation Studies program. He is also an RCL postdoctoral fellow in the University of Toronto's Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and a former SSHRC postdoctoral fellowship recipient, as well as a managing editor of the Journal of Indian Ocean World Studies. Dr. McQuade completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge as a Gates Scholar with a dissertation that examined the history of counterterrorism laws in colonial India from an international perspective. This research forms the basis of his first book, A Genealogy of Terrorism, Colonial Law and the Origins of an Idea. Dr. McQuade is also published widely in academic journals, such as the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, the Journal of World History, and History Compass, and has commented in current affairs for national broadcasts such as CBC and CTV. Thank you both for being here. And with that introduction, I will hand it over to Jawad to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Much appreciated for including me in this discussion. And I am presuming I am being broadcast. I can't see the video right now, but I just wanted to start off with impressions of the book by Dr. McQuade. For me, the book written by Dr. McQuade, a scholar and historian, is quite relevant to my contemporary work on South Asia, colonial era legislations on security, terrorism, and its contemporary geopolitical and ethno-religious implications and usage in post-British Indian states, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, point to the routes that these laws have taken. They are used in post-colonial nations for genuine security matters, but also have amplified ethnic and religious biases with authoritarian mindsets in the region. In terms of the history and the development of terrorism, anti-state or anti-revolutionary narratives and the accompanying laws and ideas, they continue to mold state opinion and action. A narrative has been embedded even among South Asian currently around certain peoples and stereotyping them and their practices under guises of barbarianism, violence, and religious excesses. There are examples of plenty, such as the Rohingyas and Chittagong Hill Tribe people in Bangladesh, Tamils in Sri Lanka, Baloch or Pashtuns in Pakistan, Lower Hill tribes and Madheshis in Nepal, and Muslims, tribals, etc. in India. We see this genealogy presented by Dr. McQuade in approaches towards early revolutionary organizations in British India to groups in present-day South Asian post-colonial states such as the Baloch, Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, non-violent Kashmiri movements. Laws of exception drew out of this narrative to quash these revolutionary challenges as they are to date. State of emergency and sometimes explicit martial law or emergency laws in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka have given an extraordinary growth in the control and power of the state around detention, quashing propaganda, and targeting transnational networks. What is interesting in the book for me is its departure from focusing on such security-centric research to focusing on the expansion of the legal framework, not against just perceived terrorist bandits, dacoits, or thuggies, but this threat, but against anti-colonial nationalism through draconian legislation. Certainly, the book is situated in British India. Anti-colonial movements and nationalism is at the heart of it. The idea or construct of the terrorists as the anti-state, pillaging and murdering is quite interesting. While the book edges closer to the eventual independence of India, it certainly helps the reader understand the role India played in the UN's predecessor League of Nations around discussions and multilateral work on international terrorism conventions. It globalized the terrorism narrative as the new international threat, a global criminality that threatened not only political regimes, nation states, but civilization itself. Without further ado, those are my impressions of the book. I would be happy to pose some questions to Dr. McQuade. I'm presuming he's there.
Yes, thanks so much, Jawad, for that very kind introduction.
And no, wonderful book, and like I said, it meant a lot to me, and how it sort of is of great relevance to me within my work. But Joseph, if I may call you that a little bit more informally, I thought maybe from my own understanding, and certainly for our audience, if I could pose a few questions to get a little bit more meat out of the book and share some of the research that you did. Maybe a very quick early question for me is, certainly in terms of all previous invaders to what was British colonial India, or colonial powers that came, regional influencers, missionaries, expansionists, into what, as I mentioned, became British India, they largely intermixed and intermarried with the native communities post-conquest. This includes Central Asians, Afghans, Persians, and Arabs, except for the Europeans. Maybe the Portuguese did intermarry a little bit, but not the British as much. As you point out in the book, and I quote, as British became a single paramount power, Thuggy or terrorism was an all-India criminal concern with a legal framework, such as co-conspirators, testimony, and an approver. And this was required to control it from 1836 onwards. My quick question is maybe a small one, but did the British view of colonial subjects or the process of othering impact British colonial anxieties around the Indian subjects, hence followed by violence and delegitimization of political struggles of the colonized?
Sure, thank you. Yes, so this is a central tension that I was looking to explore further within the book, is this relationship between anxiety and violence, and kind of complicating the idea of these as being kind of in contrast to each other, but actually kind of looking at the relationship between the two and how anxiety can produce violence. In terms of thinking about the anxiety, especially of the ruling administration, and the fear of kind of perceived threats to its own authority. And so this is something that has attracted more attention recently in scholarship on South Asia, with other scholars like Kim Wagner also looking at similar phenomena and how it relates to better understanding things like the Amritsar massacre of 1919. And so one thing that really defines a lot of the colonial presence in South Asia is, as you say, this kind of division that's established between the so-called European zones and so-called native zones. And this is something that actually, from a kind of literary perspective, one book that I find captures it really well is Burmese Days by George Orwell, in terms of capturing this kind of this anxiety on the part of the Europeans present within South Asia and Southeast Asia in that case, both in terms of the kind of concerns about rebellion, but also in terms of the anxieties about their own role within the culture that they're looking to rule over. And so this is something where in the earlier phase, so books by authors like William Dalrymple, for example, or Jürgen Osterhammel have looked at how in the earlier phase of colonization, there was much more appreciation for Indian culture and philosophy and languages, but that really over the course of the 19th century, this gets kind of overcome by this fear of racialized others. And this is something that also is happening alongside contemporary developments in Europe, like the development of social Darwinism, as well as attitudes towards the poor in London, reflected in the works of people like Henry Mayhew. And so this is part of a global process, this kind of reification of these categories of race, which had not played as significant a role. There were other markers of difference prior to this, but it's really with the emergence of so-called scientific racism, fields like phrenology, that looked to give kind of biological explanations for differentials of power, essentially. And so this is also reflected even within the architecture of colonial India. So if you look at the way that European zones tended to really set themselves apart from local populations, we can see this in the way that hill stations were established, in the way that European clubs would exclude Indian membership other than servants, obviously, but in terms of people actually being members and treated as equals within the clubs, this was prohibited. And so there was really this kind of this connection between the policing of those racial categories on a social level, as well as the policing of those categories at the level of administration and at the level of kind of more literal policing and the security architecture of the colonial state.
Perfect. If you would allow me, actually, just a sort of a tangent to it, but you mentioned the ethereal assassin to phantom Wahhabi. We see in your research a reference to the romanticization of European pirates, but sort of India or Arab ones caused much anxiety at that time. Certainly in chapter 1, you refer to British colonial thinking of Muslims as I quote, innate perversity of Islamic fanaticism rather than any political grievance that they may have. I think you bring it up again for me when I see it in chapter 5, that political violence in Europe in the 19th and the 20th century was framed as a continental problem, sort of very different contours to how it's sort of structured at that time. Whereas Muslims were seen as a distinct race predisposed towards religious extremism and violence. This reminds me in current times when the media and talking heads frame a sort of a white terrorist as sometimes mentally unstable, whereas the racialized person is parsed into various palatable terrorist subcategories. I bring up this verbose background to ask if our understanding of terrorism has changed, certainly from British colonial times. We now see newer categories of terrorism beyond the religious and seem, at least in the Canadian context, a little bit more cognizant of secular, political, incel, racial, or misogynist extremism. Do we get to rate the severity or types of terrorism around them or previous categories? And maybe just a sort of a couple of questions tied to that is, when do some of these political ideologies, abhorrent as they may be, come into the realm of terrorism for you and from your research background? Are all terrorists barbaric, non-state actors? That is, do we have to dehumanize the terrorists rather than try understanding? Sorry, I'm giving you a loaded few questions within the one.
Sure, no problem at all. Yeah, so this is a central tension that I found within the discussions. I mean, so as you said, in chapter 1, when looking at the 19th century, we see kind of one set of ideas, and then in chapter 5, which brings it up to just before the Second World War, it's a different set of concerns with the international legislation that's being passed at Geneva. So just to begin with the first one, what was really interesting to me about reading colonial perceptions of Islam and this term, the fanatic, which is really being coined essentially in this period, even though it's now something that we use quite regularly in kind of day-to-day conversation. The whole idea behind the fanatic was that this was a essentially different type of person that kind of lived within specific areas. So predominantly the northwest frontier of what was then India, what would now be the northwest frontier of Pakistan. And the idea that, again, kind of tying back to this idea of these very strict and kind of coherent racial categories that were very common in the 19th century, the idea that people belonging to these groups had an inherent kind of barbaric violence and were kind of prone towards what was one of the kind of quotes referred to it as a perverse religiosity. And so this was a categorization that was really contested by members of the Muslim community even at the time, as well as by some European officials, actually, it's worth noting, at the time. But specifically, this led to discussions and debates surrounding kind of the nature of Islam and better understanding Islam and the relationship between Islam and violence. And what was really interesting to me in looking at this material is just how closely some of these ideas of Islam still, resonate today within elements of the security community, within elements of the general public, in terms of this very kind of one-dimensional view of Islam as being kind of inherently predisposed towards violence. And this, like I mentioned, this is something that has been, contested by many Islamic scholars going back to the period and then up to today as well. Aisha Jalal has a good book about, it's called Partisans of Allah. It looks at the history of jihad in a more kind of historicized context. But anyway, so that was one thing that kind of stuck out to me, is this kind of this dehumanization of the Muslim fanatic as one type of so-called terrorist, and then how this compared to representations, for example, of Russian anarchists during the same period, who were seen in much more sympathetic terms. So within British literature, there's this kind of archetypal hero around the time of the kind of noble Russian anarchist who is not necessarily entirely sympathetic as a character, but who is viewed as kind of fighting against tyranny and as being, motivated by essentially European liberal ideas. And this is very much contrasted to the way that people committing similar types of crime within a colonial setting were represented. So we see that distinction in the historical context as well. And it certainly is something that I think carries through to the present day, as you identified with how the media represents different types of violence and how we kind of look to draw the line of of kind of where, what is political violence and what is terrorism. The other challenging element in this as well, when we're trying to establish a definition, is also it really comes down into our definition of what is political as well. And so this also creates difficulties, because what one person may view as religious or as ideological, someone else may view as political. And so especially when we think about things like environmental movements on kind of one end, and so-called eco-terrorists, but then on the other end moving into, as you mentioned, groups like incel groups, or people who are motivated by misogynist ideology. From a feminist standpoint, these would certainly be seen as political ideologies. Others may not view them that way. And so it does also, the further that we kind of dig down into these layers of definition, the more questions that are actually raised, and the more that we see that establishing a definition that will kind of work for everyone becomes very difficult to do, because it's not only based on that definition itself, but it's based on how we understand all the other terms within that definition, such as ideology, such as politics, in terms of motivation as well is another big part of it, because often terrorism is defined as ideologically motivated violence, but understanding an act as ideologically motivated requires us to understand the mindset of the perpetrator. And so if someone leaves, a manifesto explaining why they did what they did, this can be a lot easier. But if there is no manifesto, and if the person, dies during the commission of the act, which often happens, we see this often in these cases where there's this kind of excavation of their social media presence, of what they were reading, of what kind of groups they were involved in, to try to determine whether this person was ideologically driven. But that gets very difficult. And so from a from kind of an academic standpoint, we can define it as ideologically motivated violence, and that's more straightforward. From a legal standpoint, that becomes much more difficult, because it then shifts the burden of proof onto proving that the person was motivated by their ideology, rather than simply a person who had those views, but then may have been motivated by something else during the act. And this, from a legal standpoint, can add additional challenges in terms of prosecution.
No, for sure. Actually, I appreciate you sort of being able to sort of explain that a little. Maybe another loaded question while I'm at it. In chapter 2, when I read the book, you differentiate between, as you put it, propaganda by bomb versus propaganda by deed. where I think bombs are used as a vehicle for disseminating an anti-colonial message to a wider audience versus newspapers or pamphlets at that time. Certainly there was no social media to propagate further. But I think the first bombs in British India were between the period of 1897 to 1913. It seemed to me, reading the book, that these early political assassinations and bombings were an attempt to undermine British colonial sovereignty by exposing the morality of its representatives. The political assassinations also, as an anti-colonial resistance tactic, was a new kind of terrorism to that time. Just keeping these two specific sort of tactics or methods in mind, is there a definition or legal framework in present day? I'm sorry to bring you sort of out of British colonial times, but in present day where a non-state actor or individual could justify assassinations or violence in a legal defense context? Not only am I bringing it out into present time, but also asking you to go into the realm of sort of jurisprudence, but I just thought it was interesting how these methods had an impact and usage and justification in British colonial times, but do assassinations or bombings work in present day post 9/11 scenarios?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I'll start off just by expanding a little bit more on the idea of propaganda by deed and propaganda by bomb, just for those in the audience who may not be familiar with the terms. So the idea, this is actually how what we now call terrorism was defined or described in the late 19th century. And the idea of propaganda by deed, I think, is actually a useful way of understanding what terrorism is, because it's very much about kind of combining the violent act with the message that's being conveyed by the act. And this is really a central element in most of the definitions of terrorism that we have today, but usually get kind of bound up in this kind of cyclical definition where terrorism is an action designed to cause terror. But then how do you define terror? If it's something generated by terrorism, you know, it can become a cycle. And so even though it's a very kind of old school category, I actually like the term propaganda by deed, just because I think that it does encapsulate that actually a little bit better than some of our current language does, because it's really about understanding that terrorism is, I would say in all cases, I would say if we're kind of looking for a more universalizable definition, that it's the communicative function of the violence that actually makes it terrorism. And for an example of what I mean, you know, if we think about whether it's the early acts of so-called propaganda by deed or contemporary terrorism, it really only works in a context where there is some sort of media landscape that can convey the news of the killing beyond the immediate context. That's really where something becomes an act of terrorism, because otherwise it's just a murder, regardless of how ideologically motivated the person is. If no one knows about it other than the victim, for practical purposes, that's a murder rather than an act of terror, because no one is being terrorized by it other than, obviously, the victim. And so, so this is something where, again, so just this idea of propaganda by deed, I think is useful for conveying that it's a deed that is sending some sort of message. You know, how we interpret that message, what kind of message, these are things that are certainly kind of up for discussion, but I think as a kind of a, an underlying core for understanding what sets terrorism apart from other actions, I would say that that is an important element of it. And then propaganda by bomb is kind of my own interpretation of that in the Indian context, drawing on a number of sources, both produced by Indians and produced by British officials from the time, looking at the role that bombs specifically play. So within one of the British discussions, when they're kind of describing how to understand which actions are politically motivated, there is a quote, which I'm paraphrasing, but it basically does say that murders carried out by bomb are almost certain to be political in nature, which is a really interesting point, I think. And it was seen that way on the other end as well. It was seen that way by the revolutionaries that were using bombs. There are quite a few, once I started looking, there were actually quite a few publications that specifically really are kind of theorizing and analyzing the bomb itself as being a political tool because of how it represented an Indian mastery over Western science. And so especially within Bengal, this was seen as something that could challenge colonialism by showing essentially that people within Bengal were equally capable of using kind of the tools of modern science against colonial officials. So all of that is maybe a bit of a long-winded description, but just in terms of kind of unpacking those terms. In terms of your question, I mean, it's a really good question and it's a really tricky one. Certainly one example that I'm able to think of that was from back in 2014 was when two members of the PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, tried to claim political asylum within Canada. And I don't actually remember all of the details of how this played out, but I do remember that there was a lot of discussion at the time because the PKK was listed as a terrorist organization and continues to be listed as a terrorist organization by the government of Canada, but they were also allies in the fight against the Islamic State. And so there was discussion at the time over whether these alleged members of the PKK should be seen as being able to claim political asylum, given that their crime was essentially fighting against the Islamic State, which of course was also listed as a terrorist organization, and I would say a significantly worse one. But at the same time, because of the nature of how Canadian law prohibits political asylum for those who are affiliated with listed terrorist organizations, they were seen as being ineligible for political asylum. And so I think that this is an interesting case where there was a claim being made by the representatives to be eligible for political asylum and to have to be essentially political criminals rather than terrorists, but where still the kind of and again, it's a 2014 example, so I don't remember exactly how it played out. But from my understanding, I know that the prevalent arguments at the time was that regardless of whether we may on a moral level think that, maybe if these individuals were specifically involved in violence only against the Islamic State, that may be something that's kind of hard for us to really take issue with, that still their membership within the PKK prohibited them from political asylum. Where I think it would get really interesting as a legal case would be a group that was recognized in some quarters as a terrorist organization, but was not actually listed as one by the federal government. And so I'm thinking of a group like the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, for example, which is the armed movement composed of Rohingya within Myanmar who were fighting against the Myanmar military, as well as so staging attacks, certainly, but also looking to defend members of the Rohingya community from the violence that was being carried out by the local Rakhine population and the Tatmadaw, which is the Myanmar armed forces. So I don't know whether this is something that has come up, but this would be something that I would think would pose a really interesting example, and in some ways a test of all of these factors, because I think that this is a group that many in Canada, would draw some sympathy from, maybe not necessarily in terms of their methods, but in terms of their ideology or kind of where they fit within our own priorities, as the government of Canada has very strongly condemned the violence meted out against the Rohingya community by Myanmar. So I think this would be the kind of group that would raise these kinds of interesting questions about where we draw the line then in terms of who is considered to be a terrorist versus who is eligible for political asylum.
No, for sure. Actually, I spent a little bit of time in Afghanistan and seconded over to the Canadian military. And I remember some similar discussions, both at a national level, but also within ISAF, the multilateral sort of effort that was going on at that time, vis-a-vis former warlords in Afghanistan who became allies. We set up this Afghan liaison police force with former Taliban, just working with people who had shady past, potentially international sort of warrants, but that were used at that time. So, a very good example in terms of PKK or Kurdish elements that may have been allies with the ISIS. But I think it's an ongoing discussion. But if you'd allow me, maybe another sort of question, if I could pose connected to that. I think for me, in chapter 3, you also bring up the war as a space in which colonial officials sought to create a new legal ordering of empire through the expansion of pre-existing corridors of imperial and indeed global jurisdiction. I think this is a wartime expansion of emergency laws. Certainly, you point to a key event in war, the Singapore Mutiny, the Lahore Conspiracy, and the Komagatu Maru, which is very familiar to Canadians. But I think just connected to that, in chapter 4, you expand your research to the security apparatus after earlier discussions on surveillance networks. This touches on sort of asymmetrical warfare, militarization of imperial policing, and the Emergency Powers Act, the Suppression of Terrorist Outrages Act of 1932. For me, this is a time when the British colonial power changes the label of revolutionary to terrorist under the prose of counterinsurgency. I think we have cemented the state authority, as I see in your book, especially as a sole dispenser of violence in colonial India, but also in most current nation states. So the question I pose to you with this sort of background from your book is, I'm going to bring up a few historical legal, these historical legal framework references to current territorial disputes or separatist or freedom struggles, depending on how one views them. And I can give you multiple examples, whether it's Kurds, Baloch, Palestinians, Kashmiris, Uyghurs, Chechens, in the southern Philippines, Ethiopia, Eritrea. But even where even in current times, similar anti-terrorist or emergency powers have been promulgated by these nation states to control or target or defeat these groups or these insurgencies, or in some cases terrorist groups. Does this change the nature of how we understand these separatist and insurgent struggles, especially the state as a sole dispenser of violence?
Sure. Yeah, this was, one thing that really interested me about, well, there were kind of two things that interested me about looking at the colonial period for understanding this, because my own interest in it really was also informed by an interest in contemporary issues as well. One, just from the standpoint of access, is that what's really great about looking at historical documents is there's much more that's available and unclassified. And so it was possible to actually get into much more of the debates that were happening behind closed doors, which is what I discuss in that chapter in terms of actually in both of those chapters, in terms of how we can see a distinction between how officials are describing the revolutionaries behind closed doors versus how they're describing them publicly. There's that exchange that I write about where the Secretary of State literally changes the wording within the draft of the document from revolutionary to terrorist, and the Viceroy says that revolutionary is more appropriate, but that he'll call them terrorists publicly because this makes it easier to defend in Parliament. And so I think that what's really, I think what's useful about that is that because we're able to access these kind of things that are going on behind the scenes that just wouldn't be possible to access in the case of, say, contemporary Myanmar, it can give us insight into some of the thought process that goes on sometimes within this labeling. This certainly isn't necessarily the case in every example, but there also certainly are examples where we know that there is a very cynical deployment of this category. We can see this in China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I think that that's something that within Western countries, I don't think many people would argue with the fact that these detention camps are, anything other than detention or concentration camps. There's not, I don't think many people would kind of buy into Beijing's narrative that these are really just counterterrorism, detention centers. And so we do know that there are cases where it can be used this way. And so I think that understanding and being able to really look into the private correspondence and these kind of documents that were secret at the time can give us some insight into how, this labeling of individuals as terrorists is something that, at least in some cases, is very much a deliberate decision. by those who were doing the labeling. This was the case with the colonial officials, as the book shows. And so from there, I think that we can also kind of, hypothesize or make, educated guesses in terms of how it's being used in cases like Myanmar. So there were actually two cases just within the last 30 days that I think are really interesting examples of this. So one is in the case of Myanmar, where I'm sure that most of those in the audience would be familiar, but just as very basic kind of background, that there was a coup in February. The democratically elected government was deposed by the military junta, and as a result of this, there have been massive protests that began peacefully, but have also devolved into violence as a result of very heavy-handed oppression by the Myanmar military authorities, who have killed hundreds. So those among the democratically elected officials who have escaped detention have set up what's called the National Unity Government, which is a kind of shadow government in exile. The National Unity Government initially was referred to by the Myanmar military as being an illegal association, but just this month they have upgraded that designation to within its list of terrorist organizations. And so this has very real consequences in terms of individuals who may be sympathetic to what is, again, important to emphasize, a democratically elected deposed government. In this labeling of them as terrorists, this has very clear legal functions, as well as a chilling effect on members of the civilian population or the military or journalists who may, want to support this group. I know that we don't have a ton of time before we open it up for audience questions, but just the other example that was really interesting that I would just encourage people to look into is in Papua in Indonesia, where similarly this separatist movement was labeled just as of April 28th, 29th, 30th, somewhere around there, was also labeled as a terrorist group. And it's a different situation, but I think similar dynamics at play there.
Sure. Maybe just one final question before we open up to the audience from me. I think in 2021, sort of using your book as my anchor and how you talk about terrorism and its legislative development, in 2021, do we leave room for any legal armed dissent, social justice land fighters, insurgents, separatist, revolutionary organizations in oppressive states, amongst colonized communities, or any political act of resistance against a colonial state or a repressive state? Because I think we still have a fair amount of autocrats or countries that are occupied by a neighboring country or not. Just your sort of final thoughts. We live in a much more securitized world post 9/11, post our engagement in Afghanistan, ISIS, and what's happening in the Middle East.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is such a central tension, and one of the main reasons that it's been impossible to really have a universal consensus on how to define terrorism is that, we know this kind of phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But I think that you could also say in some ways, today's terrorist is tomorrow's freedom fighter, and today's freedom fighter is tomorrow's terrorist. And I think that history, the history of the 20th century and more recently really bears that out. That's not going to be the case in every example, certainly, but there are enough examples where it is to make it complicated. And there are many now democratically elected governments around the world in places like Ireland and South Africa that were labeled terrorists at one time. And so I think that we need to recognize that, and in making our assessment, that doesn't mean that for groups like Al-Qaeda or like the Atomwaffen division, which is a neo-Nazi international group, it doesn't mean that groups like this need to be kind of given a seat at the table in these conversations. There are going to be, cases where there are genuinely, very extremist ideologies at play that don't lend themselves to political resolution. But I think that what I would say in terms of looking at this within the larger historical context is that it's really important when using these labels to be really thinking through and applying that kind of critical thinking, and especially when we're hearing those labels that are being assigned by others, thinking about how they've arrived at those designations as well, and really thinking about whether that actually aligns with how we would describe groups too. And so, you know, also just thinking about how in many of these cases, it's difficult to actually set up because of the fact that these things are fluid and can change from one to another over time. I think that the binary between a terrorist and a freedom fighter in some ways needs to be replaced by more of an almost spectrum or continuum, where you may have at the two ends, you know, you may have a nonviolent independence movement that you can fully get behind, and you may have an extremist, very violent movement like ISIS that has, you know, there's no kind of way of, you know, supporting. But in between there, thinking about how groups may fit kind of more towards one end, more towards another, or as their personnel and tactics and ideas change over time, how they may actually move from one area to the other.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for sharing your book with me, but I think we may have some questions from our panel, so I'll hand it over to Nicole.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jawad.
Yes, thank you so much, Jawad, and thank you so much, Dr. McQuade. That has been a very insightful discussion. But we do have a lot of questions from the audience, so let's move on to a couple of those. The first one is about the people who are considered freedom fighters in India. For example, Bhagat Singh, performing acts which would be considered terroristic and are regarded as such vis-a-vis Kashmir. How has the locus of what constitutes terrorism shifted in Indian society post-independence?
Sure. It's a really good question, and it's one thing that's really interesting. So in the conclusion of the book, I have I've included a photo of Amit Shah, who's the president of the BJP, laying a garland on an image of Khudiram Bose, who was executed as a terrorist by the British in 1908, 1909. And so certainly we've seen this transition happen. For some of these figures, some of them are still kind of not necessarily part of the kind of mainstream nationalist kind of set of freedom fighters that are kind of recognized now, but many are. And I think a lot of it in these colonial settings has to do with kind of, you know, when the location of sovereignty shifts from the colonizing power to the local population, the kind of moral baggage that is attached to these figures shifts as well. Even if we look at the American example, I mean, if, you know, George Washington and the founding fathers had been existing, you know, 100 years after they did, it's very likely that the British would have referred to them as terrorists, even though that's, you know, certainly not something that Americans would, you know, refer to them as today. And so I think that it's a similar dynamic in places like India, as well as Ireland too, where Sinn Féin, for example, was branded a terrorist organization and now is, you know, a legitimate part of the Irish government.
Very
If I may, sorry, could I add a couple of things to that answer? Just if I may. I think we very much see that as we see the peace talks happening in Afghanistan, how you bring in something like the Taliban or the Haqqani network into potentially a post-national unity government fold who were regarded as terrorists, and the amount of violence that they've netted. But Joseph, I think I'd add a couple more things. I think certainly in post-colonial India, when you talk about sort of Kashmir, the very same groups could be seen in a very different light across the border in terms of the resistance that they push towards Indian security forces. So even in terms of historical changes, you point out with now Home Minister Amit Shah, who is putting a garland around what may have been a terrorist in the British colonial times, I think in contemporary times, different communities, nations see the same person, the same group in a different light. But I'd also attach maybe from my work mass casualty attacks. So small C resistance sometimes is seen in a different light, but when it becomes a group which is conducting mass casualty attacks, I think it all of a sudden takes a different color. Sorry, I was just adding my 2 cents to your answer.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's true.
Wonderful. That's a great answer from both of you. So we have another question. Do you see any parallels between the British Rajas regarding freedom fighters as terrorists and the government of India's treatment of Naxalites, i.e., left-wing armed insurgents?
Sure. Yeah. Definitely. It's one thing that I'm really interested in. It actually is how, in some cases, this is a literal matter of using the same laws that were used by the colonial government. And so an example of that is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So that's not, I'm to my knowledge, that hasn't been used specifically against the Naxalites. That it might be, but I'm familiar with it in the context of the Northeast and Kashmir. But so this is a law that was originally passed in 1942, and it was directed not even actually against the so-called terrorist movement, but about against Gandhi and the Quit India movement. And so this law gives a lot of discretion, not only to the central government, but actually to local officers, right down to the rank of non-commissioned officers, to exercise a lot of discretion in terms of even going so far as using lethal force, conducting warrantless arrests. And so, like I mentioned, this was initially imposed against Gandhi and his independence movement in 42. It was reintroduced in 1958 to deal with an insurgency that was happening in India's northeast, and it's since also been applied to Jammu and Kashmir in 1990. And so I think that this is a really good example of how that kind of the logic of policing, but also the literal infrastructure of policing has kind of moved from one situation to the other. In terms of the Naxalites specifically, again, I'm not as familiar with the exact law that's being used in the so-called Red Corridor, but there is some really good work by a colleague at University of Toronto named Shivaji Mukherjee. So I would encourage you to look into his work because he has done research on the Naxalites, and he draws comparisons to the colonial period as well.
Wonderful. Jawad, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, or?
Actually, no, I think Joseph has addressed it. I think in terms of AFSA, the law that he talked about, certainly I think we've seen its use in independent India, in the Northeast, around the Naxalites. But I do know that in more recent years, the same law has been adapted for different states. So when the Indian government has been negotiating with a group like ULFA or factions of it, or in certain parts of India with the Maoists over there and their factions, I think how much has the law been enforced, when it's been rescinded, and sort of the aspects of forgiving crimes and bringing them into a political fold. I think we've seen a very creative use, if I could put it, from Indian administration all the way to the Red Corridor, as Joseph points out, to address different separatist movements, insurgent groups, tribal sort of movements, and certainly the Naxalites.
Very interesting. So the next question takes on a sort of different view. It's about cyber terrorism, and it's tied to your discussion about terroristic deeds. So they'd like to know if you consider cyber terrorism, i.e. hacking of infrastructure, to be an act of terrorism equivalent to traditional terroristic deeds such as hijacking, assassinations, and rocket attacks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It was really interesting to see Jens Stoltenberg fairly recently say that a cyber attack would be considered the same as an attack from, as a conventional attack from the standpoint of NATO. Yeah, I mean, I think that in general terms, I think that yes, they certainly can be equivalent. I think it depends on what the nature of the attack is. So, you know, is there going to be loss of life? Is there going to be significant damage to infrastructure that can cause loss of life, or that can cause, you know, people to lose access to water or to healthcare or things like that, because these are certainly conceivable within kind of an infrastructure-directed cyber attack, and could then be just as consequential as a conventional bombing, perhaps even more consequential, depending on kind of the scope of it. So I would say in principle, yes, I think that it can be as significant. I think that in practice, it will vary a lot. And so it would be kind of, I wouldn't say in general terms that one was better or worse than the other, because I think it really depends on what the consequences are of either specific incident.
Wonderful. So this is another.
Yeah, I agree with Joseph. If I could just add very quickly, I think that you certainly point out in terms of non-state actors, individuals, and the cyber activities and the threat they pose to any democracy. But I think in more contemporary times, we're also seeing increasingly after the previous US presidential election and sort of other cyber as a tool of how it threatens democracies in general from potentially state actors. So the issue of foreign interference or influence activities, separate though from sort of individual or non-state actor cyber terrorist activities, certainly I think are capturing a lot of attention, I know, government-wide.
Sure, and also just to jump in again, but the way that they can be used to inflame tensions between communities, to motivate acts of violence, whether of conventional terrorism, whether of mob violence. This is something that we've been interested in with the Center of Disinformation program, is looking at how these kind of things that are occurring within the online world have direct implications for the health and safety of people in the kind of offline world as well.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. So we have a few more questions. One of them has to do with how the term terrorism is used in the media. So one of our audience members mentions that Reuters has a policy not to use the term terrorist at all, claiming that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Is that an appropriate policy, or in your mind, or in the history of what terrorism is and the idea of it? How do you think that policy sort of weighs out?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it can be. I think that it depends on what we view the term as achieving, right? And so I think that if the objection to them not using it is that this is somehow undermining or downplaying the severity of attacks, I think that itself reveals a lot about how political the term is then. And so I think that that's actually not necessarily a reason why they should be using it. I think that what's more important than whether the term, and I mean, it really is a great question. It's something I've been asked before in terms of, should we just scrap the term entirely then? And I think that it's, from my perspective, it's about making sure that we're having as consistent a usage as possible, that we're clear about how we're drawing our definitions, that we're, applying it as evenly as we're able to, and kind of using it in an analytical capacity rather than as kind of a cudgel to essentially bludgeon certain communities with, which is very much the way that it can be used and that it sometimes lends itself to. So I would say that I don't necessarily have a strong perspective myself on whether it should be used or not used, but what I would say is that whether it's being used or not used, I would want that to be consistent. And so I would want that to be something that is based on a very kind of firm reasoning and kind of legal categories and clear deliberation. And then I think that if that's being achieved, then whether the decision is to use the term or to not use the term, I think that I can kind of go either way on that.
Very interesting.
The tough question to Joseph on this in terms of terminology, since he is the researcher on terrorism. Voila.
All right. So just to go back, take a step back and go back to sort of the cyber terrorism lens. Given the rise of digital terrorism and extremism online due to the internet and how connected our world is today, does terrorism today continue to mirror the terrorism of centuries ago, or do we really need to think of it as a different thing, particularly online?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think that there are a lot of there are still I would say there's still more that makes it similar than makes it different if we're talking about from the late 19th century onwards, but I completely agree if we're talking about before the late 19th century. The big change that happens is the rise of the mass press and higher literacy rates, more people being able to access the news through print media at that time rather than online, but still with a far greater density than what you had at any previous time in history. And so for me, I agree in terms of looking at the earlier period. I don't really like to use the term prior to really the French Revolution, and even then kind of more from the late 19th century onwards, because I do just think that if we look at some of the groups that are kind of pointed out in this sense, like the Sicarii in first century Palestine, or the Hashashin in during the Crusades, for example, these are groups that are kind of clandestine groups of assassins. And so this is where people draw the similarity, and there is some similarity there. They have political motivations. But in terms of, I just think that the nature of the media landscape is so different in these pre-modern contexts that I'm not sure that that it's really kind of the same kind of, within the same realm of analysis. It may be similar or adjacent, but for me, it is doing something different when you have, for example, when the revolutionary Rashbari Bose throws a bomb at the Viceroy of India on December 23rd, 1912, it is known within 12 hours in London, and it's in the press within 12 hours in London. To me, that kind of speed of communication, I mean, now it would be known, a minute later, but still, I think that kind of, the difference between previously when it would have taken months for the news to get there to kind of 12 hours, I think that's a greater gap than the gap between 12 hours and 1 minute, even though that itself is still, a major development.
Very interesting. Jawad, do you have anything you'd like to add to this particular question?
Actually, I think Joseph addressed it, but the only thing I can think of is certainly in terms of evolution, I think the methods, the means, they certainly, we need to, certainly where I work, need to constantly keep ourselves updated in terms of the understanding of terrorism. So certainly looking at from British colonial times to present day, I think whether it's in terms of groups, terminology, their methods, we're forever trying to sort of catch up and make sure we are better sort of understanding them to tackle such threats within at least the Canadian context and how we advise our senior officials. But I think certainly cyber does pose these interesting challenges of how do you sort of connect around it, how do you work with different jurisdictions where this particular person may be sitting in a country that you may not have friendly relations with, but maybe threatening your infrastructure, critical infrastructure. But all in all to say, I think these questions continue to help us move further ahead in terms of our work to be able to tackle the sort of changing nature of the terrorists, if I could use that word broadly.
Great. So I think we only have time for one more, but I'm going to try and mix two together so we can get a good discussion on those. So I think this question comes out of your discussion earlier about how Russian anarchists were viewed differently by colonial authorities than other terrorist organizations or other people. Our audience member asks, what are the colonial implications of terrorism related to right-wing extremism today? And can we see today as a form of terrorism?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And it's an interesting example of another feature of how terrorism is defined, which is that terrorism is typically something is defined as terrorism when it is something that is actually striking against the majority, I would say, rather than against a minority, which is not to say that minorities aren't, obviously also terrorized. But what I mean by that is that when an ideology fits within kind of the normative framework of a society, then the terrorization of minorities within that society is then also kind of part of that normative structure. So if you look at the work of the, what the Ku Klux Klan was doing, for example, this was, by any of our definitions today, terrorism, but because they enjoyed support among many, important factions, within the American public, they weren't seen as the kind of public safety threat that is the case when it is a group whose targets are actually the majority population. And so I think that when you look at right-wing extremism, I think that I think that many countries have been slow to recognize the danger posed by right-wing extremism, and I think part of this is because, if we look at a country like Canada, and Jawad mentioned earlier the Komagata Maru incident, for example, that was very much based on this idea of maintaining Canada as a white settler space, and that is very much a part of that history from the period that I'm discussing, and so I think that groups that are aligned with that type of thinking of Canada as a white space, there has been a bit slower of a response to recognize them as being terrorist groups. I think that that is changing now, and I think that that is actually something that has been really interesting to follow. I follow closely the work of the Terrorism Listing Division within Public Safety Canada, and they've added a number of far-right groups to their listing just within the last few years, groups like Blood and Honor, Combat 18, the Proud Boys more recently. So I do think that this is something that is now changing. I think that there's more recognition of this. This is something that's not just being pointed out, by kind of left-wing academics. This is something that the FBI has referred to. So this is very much being seen increasingly at various levels of the kind of defense and policing establishment as being a serious threat that needs to be dealt with. And I mean, just looking at the statistics, I don't have them right here in front of me, but I know that from 2008 to 2017 is when the one study I looked at was done, and it was somewhere between 60 to 70% of fatalities resulting from terrorism in the United States were a result of right-wing extremist groups, and then another 26 to 27% were jihadist groups. So certainly that's not to say that jihadist groups aren't still a danger. That's still a quarter of the casualties, but the majority were actually being carried out by right-wing extremists. So certainly it is, high time that that is recognized as being the security threat that it is.
Wonderful.
I agree with you. I'll give him the last word. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, with that, I think we have to come to a close. Thank you so much, Joseph, Jawad. That was an amazing discussion. And to our audience, if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow us on social media to learn about our upcoming events. We typically do about one a week, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.